If I could, I'd like to invite you all to come in and take a seat. Last we left Joseph, he was settling his father and his brothers into the land of Goshen, which again, that's a part of the Nile Delta in Egypt. The famine at this point had been severe for 2 years, so 2 years out of the 7 that had been prophesied. And life, as those people knew it, had to be deteriorating. It must have been a lot like people during the Great Depression in the way that their lives were changed so drastically because of that situation. And people were beginning to panic, no doubt, as their very survival was at stake. And so we're in Genesis chapter 47. And verse 13 says, there was no food. However, in the whole region, because the famine was severe, both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying, and he brought it to Pharaoh's palace. When the money of the people of Egypt and Canaan was gone, all Egypt came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? Our money is all gone." "Then bring your livestock," said Joseph. "I'll sell you food in exchange for your livestock since your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for their horses, their sheep and goats, their cattle and donkeys. And he brought them through that year with food in exchange for their livestock. And so all the private reserves of wheat, it's gone. And so in desperation, notice it's the Egyptians. They approached Joseph, and their money's gone. But not all their assets are gone, are they? They've still got their livestock. They've still got their land. And so if they kept their livestock at this point, what would happen? The livestock was going to starve too. If there wasn't any grain for them to eat, there wasn't any pasture land either. And so in a sense, what Jacob did for them was really a favor, wasn't it? So he buys their livestock in exchange for enough food for them to live for another year. A year later, they find themselves in the same mess again. And so it says in verse 18, when that year was over, they came to him the following year and said, "We cannot hide from our Lord the fact that since our money's gone and our livestock belongs to you, there's nothing left for our Lord except our bodies and our land. Why should we perish before your eyes, we and our land as well? Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we with our land will be in bondage to Pharaoh. Give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate." So, now they have no money, they have no livestock, but they still possess 2 commodities, don't they? What are those 2 commodities? Property and their labor. Okay, and so they offer these to Joseph. It's at their own suggestion, okay? It's at their own suggestion that they exchange their land and their labor for food. Verse 20, so Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude from one end of Egypt to the other. However, he did not buy the land of the priests because they received... Who would these priests be, by the way? Yeah, these are pagan priests, okay? because they received a regular allotment from Pharaoh and had food enough from the allotment Pharaoh gave them. That is why they did not sell their land. And so the land becomes Pharaoh's. Now in verse 21, instead of the NIV's saying, and maybe some of your Bibles say the same thing if you don't have the NIV, it says something like Joseph reduced the people to servitude. There are some translations, some manuscripts that say that Joseph moved the people into the cities. If that's the case, why would he have done that? Why would he have had the people move into the cities? Maybe, we don't know the answer for sure. It sure would have made distributing the grain a lot easier, wouldn't it? If the people were in the cities rather than scattered all through the countryside. But we don't even know if that's the proper translation or not. Okay? Verse 23 says, Joseph said to the people, now that I have bought you and your land today for Pharaoh, here's seed for you so that you can plant the ground. But when the crop comes in, give a fifth of it to Pharaoh. The other 4/5 you may keep as seed for the fields and as food for yourselves and your households and your children. You've saved our lives, they said. May we find favor in the eyes of our Lord. We will be in bondage to Pharaoh. So Joseph established it as a law concerning land in Egypt, still in force today. Now, this is Moses that's writing this, and so Moses is saying it's still in force by the time I'm writing this, that a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. It was only the land of the priests that did not become Pharaoh's. So here the terms of the people's servitude is spelled out. Once they can raise crops again, what is the agreement? 1/5, 20% goes to Pharaoh. Okay? This was actually relatively generous. We think things are very different today than they have been historically, but so much has really not changed all that much. Do you know what the tax rate was for people in that day and time generally? It's somewhere from 1/3 up to 60%. Who among us wouldn't settle for 20% at this point, right? So it's fairly generous. And so while these people offer themselves in bondage to Pharaoh, we see in verse 19, let's understand when we think of bondage, where does our mind usually go? To the United States back in the 1800s, right? Slavery. But is that really what's described here? This is really much more like feudalism. Or as we practiced it, and some of you probably have relatives who were sharecroppers, right? What does that mean, sharecroppers? That's right. You farm someone else's land, they get a share of what's produced, and you get the rest. And that's really basically what's happening here in Egypt. Yeah, it still goes on in many places. Yeah. Okay. So this is even more generous than that, right? So in a sense, would we consider sharecroppers to be slaves? No, but in a sense they're in servitude too, aren't they? They're under contract pretty much that they're going to provide this. And that's the arrangement that appears was made in Egypt. They're more like vassals. And then, I want to again say, verse 26 says, Moses says, and this is still the practice today, which would be what, about 400 years later. It's still the practice in Egypt. Now, let's recognize that the Egyptians bear some responsibility for them being in this situation. And here's what I mean by that. We know that Joseph was a great administrator, right? Second in command in Egypt. He comes up with these ideas that saves basically the known world at that time. He's a great administrator. Don't you think Joseph had made it clear to the Egyptians, hey, look, we're going to have 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Now, let's don't feel too uppity about this, because what if we knew that in the United States we were going to have 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine? How many people you think would just live that 7 years of plenty like it's just going to go on forever? And so when the 7 years of famine come, they got nothing. And it appears that's pretty much what happened with the Egyptians. Verse 27 says, now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. Catch this. They acquired property. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. So while the Egyptians were destitute during this famine, the Israelites, they're flourishing. And maybe they were acquiring land and cattle from these Egyptians who were going to have to sell out anyway. Now, here's where we get into an ethical question. Was it wrong for the Israelites to prosper while the Egyptians were suffering? I hate these kinds of questions. But I will say this. Have you ever gone to a going out of business sale? And as you were going to purchase something, did you insist that the person going out of business sell it at full price? Or did you take advantage of that? Okay? And that's what the Israelites are doing. Their prosperity at this time, though, actually paves the way for, historically, ever since this time, the world has been anti-Semitic. Harold Steigers, in his commentary on the book of Genesis, calls these verses we just read, verses 13 to 26, foundations for oppression. And here's what he means by this. I know some of you really like history. I'm a history nut. Some people don't care for it, but I'm going to give you a quick, brief history lesson here, okay? I think it's helpful to our understanding of what's going on here. Before Joseph and Jacob had ever even come to Egypt, there had been an influx of Arabic Semitic people into Egypt. Now, Semitic people, who did that include? Jews, but who else? Arabs. And so these are people who have come from, Jordan, Israel, places like that, and they've already come to Egypt. And where have they settled? Most of them settled in this area of Goshen, we know historically, okay? They congregated here in the the delta area of Egypt. And over a period of time, these people who were known as the Hyksos, these people began to have political power, political clout. They formed a political coalition. And at a weak point in history, when the Egyptian political power was weakened, the Hyksos coalition overthrew the throne of Egypt and had put in place a Hyksos pharaoh. You with me up to this point? It's not an Egyptian pharaoh. It is a Hyksos pharaoh. And guess when they think this might have fallen historically? It is quite probable that the Pharaoh who exalted this Israelite, Joseph, was this Hyksos Pharaoh, who would have been more favorable toward the Israelites than an Egyptian Pharaoh would have been. With me so far? Okay? And this makes a big difference in what we see happening during this time. A fellow Palestinian would have been more trusted in the position Joseph was in by a Hyksos Pharaoh than by an Egyptian Pharaoh. And it also explains why the Pharaoh would, at this time, would have encouraged the Israelites to come and settle, because the Israelites are going to bring more political support for a Hyksos Pharaoh than they would for an Egyptian Pharaoh. Everyone with me on this? Okay. Doesn't that help to make sense? If that's what happened. We don't know for positive, sure, but it sure seems to fit this narrative better. So here's what happened then. Later on, when Joseph had long since died, and the Hyksos dynasty had now been overthrown by the Egyptians put an Egyptian Pharaoh back in position. And they no longer feel favorably toward the Israelites. After all, what had the Israelites done? They multiplied. They made profit off the Egyptians in a difficult time. They were supportive of a Hyksos political bloc rather than Egyptians. So they're seen as a threat. Okay? And if another attempt is ever made to overthrow Egypt, it's very likely that the Israelites are going to support that. So, it's no wonder that they were disliked and distrusted and dealt with seriously when Egypt gets into power again. Which might help to explain this. This is in Exodus chapter 1. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all the generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Now, if you're an Egyptian, what's that going to make you feel like? You're going to feel threatened, aren't you? They're going to run us out. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to the people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. Does that at least help to maybe, if that's historically what happened, doesn't it make more sense of this story than we had this one Pharaoh who just happened like Joseph, and then we have this other Egyptian Pharaoh, and all of a sudden he's opposed to Joseph and to Israel. So, anti-Semitism has been common in our world ever since. Before World War II, Germany was suffering economically. I mean, you do realize the Great Depression wasn't just an American phenomenon, right? And so Germany was suffering. But the successful bankers and financiers in Germany during that time were Jews. And so what did Hitler do? Hitler convinced the people of Germany that the Jews were the reason they were suffering like they were. They were the reason that they were experiencing economic woes in their country. And so we have the Holocaust. You may wonder how I'm getting to this place in this story, but I just think it's important for us to notice a few things about what's going on here that we can apply to ourselves. So let me just make a few observations up to this point, okay? Freedom is a privilege. It's not a right. Now, we Americans think it's a right because, after all, where do we find it written? In the Bill of Rights. But historically, freedom has not been a right, it's a privilege. Most people who have lived have not enjoyed the freedoms that we in America have enjoyed. And my concern is that as we assume freedom to be a right rather than a privilege, we can come to take it for granted. And I think we need to be real careful of that. Second observation. Prosperity is not a right, but it's a privilege and a responsibility. Deuteronomy 15 and verse 11 says there will always be poor people in the land. Now, I've heard many people quote that through the years when you're saying we need to deal with the issue of the poor. Oh, there's always going to be poor people in the land. The Bible says that. Yeah, but then what does it say? Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. And when we find ourselves, wherever we find ourselves, in poverty or in prosperity, Paul says we need to learn the secret of contentment, right? No matter what. He says, I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And then that athletic verse that gets totally pulled out of context. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Third, the issue of poverty cannot be solved simplistically. I think oftentimes we get dragged into these discussions where we make it seem, well, all we need to do is blank. If people would just do blank, it's not that simplistic. It's much more complicated than the way we often approach it. And I've heard Christians express opinions from one extreme to another on how to deal with poverty. So let me give you a scenario. You're leaving the Walmart parking lot, which in itself is a reckoning with danger, right? But you're leaving the Walmart parking lot, and at one of the exits, there's a man standing there with a cardboard sign that says, hungry, in need of food. What do you do? What's the right thing to do? I'm just going to let you think about that for a minute. Because a number of things enter into your decision, don't they? One thing is, as we ought to always ask ourselves, what would Jesus do? But even that's a simplistic answer to that, isn't it? Because we're not sure what Jesus would do in that particular situation. You know why? He would have known the heart of that person, and we don't. Okay? So, then it might go through our mind, does this person deserve my help? And this one's a little tricky. Because we don't want to simply enable bad behavior, do we? Are we doing that person any good by just enabling? But at the same time, we should not be judgmental, right? I told you this is more difficult than we sometimes make it sound. And then there's people who would argue, well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what kind of situation. It doesn't matter if they're lying to me. I need to help them. And I could argue all three of those things. Couldn't you? And this is a dilemma that HL and others on our benevolence deacons deal with. BD. They deal with this every week, every day. So the answer's not just always so clear-cut. But regardless of where we are on this issue, we are obligated to protect the poor. Now, however we figure that out, and however we can still stay in close relationship with God through it, we are obligated to help the poor. Proverbs 29 and verse 7 says, "The righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern." And so, let's don't turn a deaf ear to people who, for instance, when it comes to the right to life issue, which is a huge issue for Christians in our country, right? Right to life. This movement that focuses our attention on the rights of the unborn. And that's exactly where we need to be on that issue. But there seems to be an inconsistency when we're concerned about the right of the unborn, but once they're born, we no longer hold that same concern. So, here's where I am on it, and I even admit to you as I speak that there are holes in my reasoning. Most of you know I'm president of WARM, and our mission in the city of Decatur, or in the county of Wise County, is to make sure that there's nobody that's hungry. And there's other things we do for people as well at WARM. So, I think there's two goals to providing help that will really benefit the recipient. The first one is it should seek to preserve the dignity of the person. Sometimes those of us who help someone in these situations can come across so patronizing and so belittling of their situation that we remove their personal dignity. And that should never happen. Secondly, though, it should promote the diligence of the person. Let me show you how, from way back, even the law of Moses recognized these two things. Preserve the dignity of the person, but promote the diligence of the person. Listen to what Moses wrote, Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 9. "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God." Do you see how that meets both of those requirements? This is preserving the dignity of that person, but it's also, you don't go out there and gather that for them. You allow them to go and gather it for themselves. Okay? Anyway, I just thought that was important to share through this story. But with the remaining minutes I've got, let's return to the story of Jacob. Jacob seems to have been dying ever since we met him. I mean, Jacob's always talking about his impending death. Oh, KC? Maybe. Yeah? I wouldn't assume that. I think there was a portion he took for that. He wouldn't have taken everything the people had. I don't know. If you go back and read about the Egyptian civilization at this time, you would be shocked at how advanced they were. Shocked. Well, that may be an assumption I'm making, yeah, but it just appears that they weren't very prepared for this on a personal level. Right. Yeah. If there was any water, you would think it would be in the Delta region, but we don't know about that. I would think lack of water would be a huge reason for there having been a famine. But they didn't have all the irrigation. I mean, they did have irrigation back then, but not nearly like we would have today. Well, and I've always wondered why the Egyptians gave the Israelites, to me, the Delta would be the prime land. Well, that could be, yeah. True, yeah, yeah. So probably didn't help you much on those two questions. God knew it was going to happen. That's where you get into how sovereign or the way God works, you know. Sometimes in the Bible, droughts and things are attributed to Satan. So I'm not going to try and get in the outguessing God business there. So we're back to to Jacob. He's been dying for a long time. And he lived his life, it seems, with this almost obsession about his death. But as he approaches his actual death, his prosperity in Egypt has not changed his priorities. As much as I have kind of picked at Jacob through this, Jacob finishes well, okay? And so I want you to see these verses beginning in verse 28. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. When the time drew near for Israel to die, notice he goes back and forth calling him Jacob and Israel. He called for his son Joseph and said to him, "If I found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they're buried. I will do as you say," he said. "Swear to me," he said. Then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. So here we find Jacob savoring the future promises of God. He was blessed to live in Egypt for 17 years, but he knew that he wasn't home. Egypt was not home. He knew what God had promised, and he trusted in it. And so he makes this arrangement with Joseph. "You promise me, son, that when I die, you will take my body back to the land that's been promised and bury me there. And not only just bury me in the land, but you bury me in the cave of Machpelah." You remember this cave? This is the cave Abraham had bought to bury Sarah in. This is where his father Isaac is buried. And he says, "You take me back and you bury me in that cave." And you can still, in Israel, go to the traditional site of the tomb of the fathers, of that's not the word, what's the word I'm looking for? Patriarchs, the tomb of the patriarchs. In his death, he makes this powerful testimony to his faith. It's a reminder to the family of Israel. Egypt is not home. And this is certainly the highlight of Jacob's spiritual life. So much so that the writer of Hebrews, in this hall of fame of faith that we have in Hebrews chapter 11, these great people of faith, this is the thing he pulls out of the life of Jacob to mention. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshiped as he leaned on the top of his staff. So, in the old song, "On Jordan's stormy banks I stand," Samuel Stinnett pictured Canaan as a type of the new creation, that which we will someday experience as followers of Jesus Christ. And you remember the words, "On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and cast a wishful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land where my possessions lie." Jacob knew that the promise of Canaan was going to be fulfilled for his people in generations to come. And so in a sense, Jacob is like the first fruits of that promise. Later on, Paul is going to say this about Jesus. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 20. "Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep." And that is good news. That's hope for us, right? That the first fruit, Jesus has risen from the dead. And it's such a temptation for us to grow comfortable here, particularly when we have it pretty good. It's so tempting for us to grow comfortable here, to put down our roots here. But we need to resist the allure of our present comfort and look forward to, with anticipation, to the future promises of God. So, beginning this Wednesday night, we're still doing some film series of classes by guys that I respect a lot, and Rick actually is going to be sharing with us on video. It's a 3-week series that he did at Pepperdine several years ago called Mist. Rick is about the same age as I am, and he went through a time, just as I have, and most of you have who are my age or older, where you begin to reflect on, this isn't going to last forever, is it? And you begin to take account of, where am I in life, and what am I leaving? And so for the next 3 Wednesday nights, Rick kind of tackles that for us. And I think if you'll be here at 6:30, you'll really enjoy that. So I want to invite you to come. Got one more lesson on Joseph, Lord willing, next week. And we'll wrap that up. So, KC, you got any more questions that I can't answer? Well, we know when they left Egypt, it says there were 2 million. I will say this. Hebrew is very interesting when it comes to the way they counted, and it's not real clear to us even. And I know some of you are going to call me a heretic for saying this, but many scholars will tell you that it's quite possible that the King James Version chose to translate that Hebrew word and make it 2 million, where it may well have been 200,000. That's still a pretty good miracle, isn't it? But that would fit more within the historical context, because we don't really know of many peoples who had 2 million people at that time. I'm not saying that number's not accurate. I'm saying if those kinds of things cause you to have some doubts about the Old Testament, realize that's because of the twist, the translation that we have chosen to use, okay? Does that make sense to you? I'm not denying it. I'm just saying there is another possibility. All right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you passed on the blessing. Yeah. Yeah.